My name is Elena Whitmore, and I am 68 years old, and I want you to understand something before I even begin to tell you this story. I'm not someone who cries easily. I'm not someone who falls apart in public. I spent decades building myself into a woman who holds her composure when the world around her is crumbling. I raised a daughter on my own for several years. I survived losses that would have broken most people. I built a career from scratch, brick by brick, relationship by relationship, year after year after year. So when I tell you that the day my son-in-law drove away and left me standing there, when I tell you that tears actually came to my eyes in that moment, I need you to understand what that means. I need you to understand just how deeply that cut, because it wasn't just the action. It wasn't just the inconvenience of being left somewhere. It was the contempt behind it. It was the absolute, careless, unashamed contempt of a man who looked at me and saw nothing worth his time, nothing worth a single extra minute of his afternoon. He didn't argue with me. He didn't explain himself. He didn't even give me the dignity of a real conversation. He stopped the car, said what he said, and drove away, just like that. Like I was a bag of groceries he'd already dropped off. Like I was an errand he'd already completed. Like 68 years of living, of working, of loving, of building, of surviving meant absolutely nothing, and I sat there. For hours I sat there. And the whole time, one thought kept running through my mind like a current under still water. He has no idea. He genuinely has no idea, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because this story didn't begin that afternoon. This story began years ago, in ways that my son-in-law never knew about and never bothered to ask about. And that right there was his first mistake. If you enjoy stories where karma doesn't arrive loudly, doesn't announce itself with trumpets and drama, but instead moves quietly, deliberately, and with extraordinary precision, then you are in exactly the right place. Make sure you like this video before we go any further. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because I promise you there are more stories where this one came from. And drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. I mean that sincerely. Every single time I see those comments come in from different cities, different countries, different corners of this earth, something in me feels genuinely moved. These stories travel, and the people who need to hear them always seem to find them somehow now. Let me tell you about my son-in-law. I've learned something in 68 years of living on this earth. I've learned it the hard way, through situations I never asked for and people I never should have trusted. But the lesson always comes back the same way, over and over again, no matter how many times life tries to teach it differently. Quiet people are underestimated constantly. It's one of the most predictable mistakes human beings make. They see someone who doesn't boast. Someone who doesn't feel the need to announce what they've accomplished or what they're capable of. Someone who moves through a room without demanding attention. And they make a calculation. They decide that person must not have much to offer, must not have much power, must not be worth much consideration. My son-in-law made that calculation about me, and I think about it now, and I almost want to laugh. Almost. Because if he had spent even 1 hour genuinely getting to know me, if he had sat down with me even once and asked me about my life, about my career, about the people I'd worked with, and the things I'd built, and the ways I'd helped others along the way, he would have known. He would have understood exactly what kind of woman he was dealing with. He would have treated every interaction differently. He would have chosen his words more carefully. He would have chosen his actions more carefully, but he didn't, because he didn't think I was worth knowing. And that was his first mistake. I worked for 31 years in commercial real estate. And I know that sounds simple when I say it like that. 31 years in commercial real estate. But let me tell you what that actually means, because I think people hear those words and they picture someone sitting behind a desk shuffling papers, maybe taking calls now and then. That is not what my career looked like, not even close. I started in my mid-30s, which was considered late by some people's standards, and I was a woman in a field that was, at that time, still predominantly male in its upper levels. Nobody handed me anything. Nobody made room for me. Nobody said, "Come on in, Elena, we've been waiting for you." What I found when I walked through those doors was a room full of men who expected me to prove myself 10 times over before they'd extend me even a fraction of the professional courtesy they gave each other without question. So I proved myself, over and over again, not out of desperation, not because I needed their approval, but because I understood something fundamental about how the world works. You build credibility quietly. You build it through results. You build it through relationships. You build it through being the person who keeps her word, who follows through, who shows up when things get hard and doesn't fold when the pressure comes. By the time I was in my 40s, I had developed a reputation in this city. Not a loud reputation, not the kind where people are talking about you at parties or writing your name in headlines. A quiet reputation, the kind that matters more. The kind where people who actually hold power and make decisions pick up the phone and call you personally when something important comes up. When they need a recommendation they can trust. When they need someone to vouch for a property, a deal, a person. When they need to know that the information they're getting is solid and not just someone trying to work an angle. I became that person. I was known for two things above everything else: my judgment of properties and my judgment of people. And in commercial real estate, those two things together are the foundation of everything. If you can look at a building and understand its real value, not just the numbers on paper but the potential, the location, the long-term trajectory of the surrounding area, and if you can look at a person and understand their character, their reliability, their capacity to perform under pressure, then you are genuinely valuable, genuinely irreplaceable, because those two skills together are rarer than people realize. I helped broker deals that shaped neighborhoods in this city. I helped connect investors with properties that went on to become some of the most successful commercial ventures in the region. And along the way, I formed relationships with people at every level of the business world: building owners, developers, corporate executives, legal teams, financial institutions. I wasn't just an agent. I wasn't just a broker. I was, for many of those people, someone they trusted, someone they consulted. Someone whose name they remembered and whose calls they always took. I retired at 65. And retirement for me didn't mean disappearing. It didn't mean cutting every cord. It meant stepping back from the daily work while keeping the relationships I'd spent 3 decades building. Those relationships didn't end just because I stopped working. Real relationships don't work that way. And I had spent 31 years making sure mine were real. My life in retirement was peaceful. And I mean that in the fullest sense of the word. Not just quiet, not just uneventful, genuinely, deeply peaceful, the kind of peace you earn. The kind that comes from having worked hard for decades and finally allowing yourself to rest without guilt, without the constant pressure of the next deal, the next client, the next call, without the relentless forward motion that defines a career in a competitive field. I woke up every morning at a reasonable hour. I made my coffee properly, with care, the way I never had time to do when I was working full days. I walked in the mornings when the weather allowed. I tended to the garden behind my house, which I had let go somewhat during my busiest years and had finally reclaimed and made beautiful again. I read more than I ever had. I cooked meals that took time and attention. I called old friends and had long conversations that didn't have to end because of a meeting coming up in 20 minutes. And I spent time with my daughter, Christine. Christine was the greatest thing in my life. I say that without hesitation, without qualification, without a single reservation. She was everything to me. She had been since the day she was born. Raising her hadn't been easy. Especially during the years I was doing it largely on my own, but I had loved every complicated, exhausting, rewarding moment of it. Watching her grow up, watching her become her own person, watching her develop her own values, her own sense of humor, her own way of moving through the world. She had a good heart. She was genuinely kind in the way that some people are just built to be. She paid attention to people. She remembered the details. She would call just to check on you, not because she needed something, but because she was thinking of you and wanted you to know it. She was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel seen, and I was proud of her. I was proud of the woman she had become. I was proud of her career and her friendships and the life she had built for herself. I told her that regularly. I made a point of it because I know how much it matters to hear those things from a parent, and I had not always had a parent who said them to me, so I was determined to be different. When Christine met her husband, I was cautiously happy for her. I want to be honest about that, cautiously happy, because I had worked with enough people in enough situations over 31 years to have developed a fairly accurate read on human character within a short period of knowing someone. And from the first time I sat across a dinner table from the man my daughter had brought home, there was something that gave me a small, quiet pause, nothing dramatic, nothing I could have pointed to and said, look, this is a problem, here is the evidence, just a quality in the way he held himself, a quality in the way he answered questions, a certain performance to him that I found myself noticing even when I was trying not to, but Christine loved him. And Christine was an adult woman with a full life and a clear mind and the absolute right to make her own choices. So I set aside my pause. I chose to be welcoming. I chose to be generous with him. I chose to give him every opportunity to show me I was wrong about that first impression. His name was Kevin. Kevin Archer. Christine changed after the marriage. I don't say that with anger. I say it with sorrow because that's the honest emotion that comes when I think about the early years of their relationship and the gradual, subtle ways my daughter became less present, less herself. It happened slowly, the way these things always happen. Not a sudden break, not a dramatic turning point, but a gentle, creeping distance. Phone calls that used to happen 3 times a week became once a week. Plans we made together started getting cancelled, rescheduled, and then cancelled again. When we did see each other, she seemed careful, measured, like she was thinking before she spoke in a way she never used to with me. I noticed. Of course I noticed, but I didn't push. I had made a decision early on in my role as Christine's mother that I would not be the kind of parent who creates pressure through expectations, who makes their children feel guilty for living their own lives. I had seen too many families fractured by that kind of parenting, and I refused to become it. So I held my concern quietly and continued to show up in whatever ways she allowed me to. Kevin, in those early years, was civil with me, polite in the surface level, slightly hollow way that some people are polite when they're performing courtesy rather than actually feeling it. He called me Alina, which was fine. He asked appropriate questions at dinners. He didn't say anything overtly disrespectful, but there was always something underneath the politeness that I could feel, a mild impatience. A subtle sense that spending time with Christine's mother was an obligation to be managed rather than a relationship to be valued. He never asked about my career, never showed any curiosity about who I was outside of my role as Christine's mother. In his mind, I think that was essentially all I was. An elderly woman, a background character in the story of his life. I noticed that too, and I stored it away, not in a vindictive place. Not in a place where I was building a case against him, planning some kind of retribution, waiting for the right moment. Just in that part of the mind where honest observations about people are kept. The part that informs your understanding of someone's character. The part that lets you know, when push comes to shove, what a person is actually made of. Kevin Archer, I came to understand over those years, was a man who valued what things appeared to be more than what they actually were. He valued status, visible status, the kind that other people could see and acknowledge. He valued his career not primarily because he found meaning in the work, but because the career was a marker of his worth in the eyes of others. He valued connections only when those connections were with people he considered to be above him in some hierarchy. People below him, or people he perceived as having nothing to offer him directly, received the dregs of his attention. I was in that second category. And that perception, that dangerous, arrogant, entirely mistaken perception, would eventually become the foundation of his undoing. There is something I need to tell you now, something I have never told my son-in-law, something I never told my daughter actually, because I made a decision years ago that this was information that should stay private. I have asked myself, in the time since everything happened, whether that decision was the right one, whether I should have been more transparent. Whether things might have gone differently if I had simply told him the truth from the beginning. And every time I ask myself that question, I come back to the same answer. No, it would not have gone differently, because the problem with Kevin was never a lack of information. The problem with Kevin was character, and character doesn't change because you learn a fact. Here is what happened. About 4 years before the day he left me standing there, I received a phone call from an old colleague of mine. A man named Arthur, whom I had worked alongside in my earlier years, and who had gone on to build a very successful property management and corporate services company. Arthur and I had stayed in touch over the decades. He was one of those people whose professional respect had translated, over time, into genuine friendship. We called each other occasionally. We met for lunch a few times a year. He was one of the people whose opinion I valued and who, I believed, valued mine. Arthur called me because his company was expanding. He was looking to bring in someone for a mid-level management position, the kind of role that required a specific combination of skills, someone organized, someone persuasive, someone who could manage both client relationships and internal teams without dropping either ball. He was having trouble finding the right person through the usual channels and had decided to reach out to people he trusted for personal recommendations. He knew Christine had recently married. He asked, in passing, what her husband did, what his background was. I told him. Kevin was in professional services at the time, doing reasonably well but in a position that had what I would describe as a low ceiling. Competent work but limited trajectory. He'd mentioned more than once during family dinners that he was looking for something with more room to grow, more visibility, more opportunities. Arthur listened. He asked a few pointed questions, the kind of questions someone with real business experience asks when they're actually evaluating, not just being polite. I answered honestly. I told him what I knew about Kevin. His organizational skills, which Christine had mentioned, were strong. His drive, which was visible even if I had reservations about what drove it. His ability to present himself well in professional settings, which I had observed at various events. I recommended him. I want to be clear about what that recommendation meant in the context of my relationship with Arthur. It was not a casual throwaway thing. When I vouched for someone to Arthur, he took it seriously, because our 30-year professional relationship was built on the understanding that we did not waste each other's time. We did not recommend people carelessly. When one of us said this person is worth looking at, the other listened. Kevin was interviewed. Kevin was hired, and I never said a word. Not to Kevin, not to Christine, not to anyone. Why? Because I didn't want it to become a thing. I didn't want Kevin feeling like he owed me something, or worse, resenting me for it, which I suspected, given his personality, was the more likely outcome. Some people, when they learn that their success came with help, feel gratitude. And some people, particularly people whose identity is built around the story of the self-made person, feel threatened, feel diminished. I had assessed Kevin as the second type. And I didn't want that dynamic in my family, so I stayed quiet. And I watched him build his career in that company, watched him get promoted, watched him gain influence and standing, watched him become more confident, more comfortable, more certain of himself and of his place in the professional world. And the whole time, the whole 4 years, not once did it seem to cross his mind that any door in his life had been opened by anyone other than himself. He believed fully and completely that he had earned everything on his own merit. He had no idea. The morning of that day began like most mornings. I was up early, had my coffee, did my small routine. I had a medical appointment that afternoon, nothing serious, a follow-up for something routine that my doctor had wanted to monitor. I had mentioned it to Christine a week earlier, more in passing than anything, and she had mentioned it to Kevin, and Kevin had offered, in that offhand way of his, to give me a ride. I should have driven myself. I know that now. I should have simply said, "Thank you, that's not necessary." But Christine seemed pleased that he had offered. It felt like an olive branch of sorts, a small gesture of the kind of son-in-law relationship I had always hoped might eventually develop, so I accepted. He arrived at my house 20 minutes later than we had arranged. I was ready and waiting, which meant I sat in my hallway for 20 minutes wondering if he was coming, which was its own particular irritation. When he finally pulled up, there was no apology for being late. He barely looked at me when I got in the car. He was on his phone speaking to someone about something work-related, holding up one finger in my direction as I settled into the passenger seat, as if to say, "Hold on, you'll get your turn." I sat quietly. I watched the city go by through the window. I didn't try to interrupt his call, but I noticed something. I noticed the energy in the car, the tightness in his jaw, the sharp, clipped way he was responding to whoever was on the other end of the call. Kevin was irritated about something. Kevin was not in a good mood, and whatever that mood was about, it was radiating off him in waves that made the interior of that car feel very small. The call ended. He said nothing to me. He just drove. Eyes forward, one hand on the wheel, the other tapping restlessly against the center console. I tried gently. I asked about Christine. He said she was fine. I asked about work. He said it was busy. I asked if everything was all right. He said yes in a tone that meant please stop asking, so I stopped. We were maybe 10 minutes from the medical center when things changed. I don't know exactly what triggered it. Something internal, something that had been building in him all morning or all week. But he suddenly slowed the car and pulled to the side of the road. Not at the medical center, not anywhere near it, just a side street, a random point on the route where he decided he was done. He put the car in park. And he looked at me, and there was something in his expression that I had never seen directed at me so nakedly before. Not politely disguised, not wrapped in any kind of social coating, just open, unvarnished impatience and dismissal. He said, and I want you to understand I am giving you his exact words. "Elena, I've got a situation at work I need to deal with. Handle it yourself from here." That was it. That was the entire thing. Handle it yourself. I looked at him. I looked at him for a moment because I was genuinely trying to understand if I had heard correctly, because the words themselves were bad enough. But it was the tone. The tone said something deeper and uglier. The tone said, "You are not worth my time." The tone said, "You are an inconvenience I've been carrying long enough." The tone said, "You are old and you are not useful to me and I have better things to do." I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say in that moment. There was no sentence I could have formed that would have been adequate to the situation. So I simply opened the door and got out of the car. And he drove away. He didn't wait to see if I was all right. He didn't watch in the rearview mirror. He just drove away. And I stood on that pavement and watched his car disappear around the corner. The medical center was roughly 1.5 miles from where he had left me. I am 68 years old and I am, generally speaking, in decent health for my age. But I was not dressed for 1.5 miles walk, and I had not eaten much that morning, and the day was not particularly forgiving in terms of weather. I made it there, slowly, and with more discomfort than I will fully describe here, but I made it there. By the time I arrived, I was tired and slightly shaken, and my feet were hurting, and my pride was hurting considerably more than my feet. I checked in. I sat in the waiting room. And the appointment, of course, was running behind, because that is how medical appointments always work when you most want to simply get through them and go home. So I sat there, and I sat there, and I sat there 4 hours in that waiting room. I watched other people come in and be greeted by family members, by spouses, by friends who had driven them and were now sitting beside them reading magazines or playing on their phones or just being there. The simple, uncomplicated presence of people who showed up. And I sat alone in my chair with my coat folded in my lap and tried to maintain a composure that was costing me more than it should have. People noticed me. The reception staff asked at one point if I needed anything. I said I was fine, and I said it with a smile that came from decades of practice. I was not fine, but I was not going to fall apart in a waiting room. That was not who I was. That was not who I had spent 68 years becoming. What I was, sitting there in that chair through those 4 hours, was furious, not in a hot, explosive way, in a cold, clear, deliberate way. The kind of fury that doesn't shake your hands or raise your voice. The kind of fury that settles in somewhere deep and becomes something harder and more permanent than anger. Something like resolve. I thought about how it had come to this. I thought about the years of being polite to a man who barely noticed. The years of watching my daughter gradually dim in ways I couldn't quite address without risking the relationship entirely. The years of understanding that my value to Kevin Archer was somewhere below zero, that I was not a person to him, but a peripheral inconvenience attached to the woman he had married. I thought about every dinner where he had talked over me, every family occasion where he had checked his phone while I was mid-sentence. Every time Christine had looked at me with that carefully controlled expression that said, "Please don't say anything, please don't push back, please just let it go." And I had let it go, over and over and over again, because I loved my daughter, because I wanted peace in her home, because I understood that there are things a parent cannot control and battles a parent cannot fight for their adult child without doing more harm than good. But sitting there in that waiting room 4 hours after being left on a pavement like something discarded, I felt something in me shift, not break, shift, like a piece of ground moving into a different position, something that had been held loosely for years finally settling into certainty. I was done absorbing this without consequence, not for revenge. I want to make that clear. This was not about revenge. I am not a vindictive person, and I have never found satisfaction in other people's suffering, not even people who have treated me badly. This was about something different. This was about the simple, fundamental truth that actions have consequences, that the way you treat people matters, that the doors in your life do not open themselves, that the ground beneath your feet was laid by someone. He needed to understand that. Whatever came of it, he needed to understand that. I took out my phone. I scrolled to a name in my contacts that I hadn't called in some time, not because the relationship had cooled. It hadn't. But because when you retire from the world you operated in for 31 years, you move into a different rhythm. The calls become less frequent, not out of distance, but out of a natural shifting of priorities. You trust that the relationship is solid enough to survive the quieter seasons. I called Arthur. He picked up on the third ring, which was typical for him. The conversation was not long. It was not dramatic. I did not give him a lengthy explanation or an emotional account of what had happened. That is not how Arthur and I spoke to each other. We spoke plainly and we spoke honestly and we got to the point, because that is how two people communicate when they have been doing it for 30 years. I told him who my son-in-law was. I told him what had happened. I told him that I wanted him to know. There was a pause on his end, brief, but I recognized it. It was the pause of someone who has just received a piece of information and is fitting it into a framework that is changing shape as they hold it. Then he said, "Understood." That was the word he used, understood. And in 30 years of conversations with Arthur, I had learned exactly what that word meant when he used it in that tone. It meant, "I've heard you, I know what this means, I'll handle it." I thanked him, we said goodbye. I put my phone back in my bag, and I went back to waiting for my appointment. Now let me tell you something that Kevin Archer did not know. Something that would have changed absolutely everything if he had taken even the most basic interest in who I was and what I had built over the course of my life. Arthur's company, the company where Kevin had worked for 4 years, the company where Kevin had been promoted twice, where Kevin had built his professional reputation, where Kevin had the title and the office and the colleagues who knew his name, where Kevin had arrived every single morning for 4 years believing that he had gotten there through his own intelligence and his own effort and his own merit alone. That company operated out of a building, and that building had an owner. Let me be very precise about this, because I want you to understand the full weight of what I'm telling you. During the later years of my career, as part of a series of investment decisions I had made with accumulated savings, and with the kind of informed judgment that comes from 31 years of watching property values and market movements and neighborhood trajectories in this city, I had purchased several commercial properties. Not many, not a portfolio that would make headlines, but a carefully selected few that I had chosen with the same precision I applied to everything in my professional life. Properties in locations I believed in, properties with long-term potential, properties in areas I had watched develop from the inside and knew, with the kind of deep contextual knowledge you can only build from decades in an industry, were going to grow in value. One of those properties was the building where Arthur's company held its offices. I had purchased it years before Kevin was ever hired there. I had purchased it because I knew the area, knew the building, knew the infrastructure of the street it sat on, and the businesses surrounding it, and the city planning decisions that would affect the block in the coming decade. I had purchased it as an investment, and it had over the years been exactly that. A quiet, steady, well-managed investment that generated income and appreciated in value. I was Kevin's boss's landlord. In the truest, most literal, most concrete sense of the word. The building where Kevin showed up every morning to prove how self-made he was. The building where he had his desk and his title and his professional identity. The building that represented everything he believed he had built through his own efforts. The lease payments for that building came to me. Kevin had no idea. Arthur knew, of course. We had worked the lease arrangement together, but it had never come up in conversation with Kevin. Why would it? I was just Christine's mother, just the background figure at family dinners, just the elderly woman who didn't warrant much of Kevin's attention or curiosity, just the woman he left on a pavement and told to handle it herself. That evening, Kevin received a call from Arthur. I know how this part of the story went because it was described to me later, in pieces, from more than one source. I will tell it to you as accurately as I am able. Arthur was not the kind of man who raised his voice. He was not the kind of man who made dramatic speeches or delivered elaborate rebukes. He operated with the same plain, precise directness that I had always valued in him. When he had something serious to say, he said it clearly, and he said it once, and he did not soften it with unnecessary cushioning. Kevin received the call late in the afternoon. The tone of it, by all accounts, stopped him in whatever he was doing. Arthur asked him to come in that evening, not tomorrow, not at his convenience. That evening, Kevin went in. Of course he went in, because Kevin understood hierarchies, and Kevin understood that when the person above you in a hierarchy asks you to come in, you come in. He walked into Arthur's office. Arthur was sitting behind his desk. He did not stand up when Kevin entered. He gestured to the chair across from him. Kevin sat down, and then Arthur said my name. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Picture it. Kevin Archer, who has spent years looking past me at family dinners. Kevin Archer, who has spent years calculating my relevance and finding it negligible. Kevin Archer, who that very afternoon had looked at me from the driver's seat of his car and said, "Handle it yourself," and driven away without a second thought. Kevin Archer sitting across from his employer and hearing my name. The account I received was that there was a silence after Arthur spoke, a long silence, the kind that fills a room with the weight of something being understood for the first time. Arthur told him, not everything, but enough. He told him that I was the person who had recommended him for this position. He told him that my recommendation had been the determining factor. He told him that without that recommendation, Kevin would not have been interviewed. He told him in that plain, direct way of his what had happened that afternoon and how he had come to know about it. And then he told him something else. He told him who owned the building. I was not there. I did not witness Kevin's face in that moment. I did not see what happened to his expression when the full picture assembled itself in his mind, when 4 years of self-made narrative collapsed under the weight of a single conversation. And the careful story he had told himself about his own success, about his own capabilities, about the hierarchy of this world and his rightful place in it, came apart in the space of a few minutes in a quiet office. But I heard about it. I heard that the confidence left his face, not gradually, suddenly, the way confidence always leaves when its foundation turns out to be made of something other than what it appeared. I heard that he sat there and did not speak for a longer time than was comfortable. I heard that when he did speak, his voice was different, quieter, less certain of itself. Arthur, from what I understand, was not cruel. He did not gloat. He did not take pleasure in the moment. Arthur was a business professional and a decent human being, and he handled it the way he handled most difficult situations, with clarity, with fairness, and without unnecessary drama, but he was clear. He was absolutely clear about what had happened, what it meant, what it said about Kevin's judgment and Kevin's character, and what the professional implications of that were going to be. He spoke about trust, about the kind of relationships that underpin business environments and the way those relationships function on a foundation of behavior that extends beyond the office walls. He spoke about the kind of man he wanted representing his company to clients and colleagues, the kind of person he wanted carrying his company's name in the world. And he made it apparent, without having to say it directly, that Kevin's current position in that company was no longer as secure as Kevin had believed it to be that same morning. The aftermath of that evening was not clean. These things never are. Life is not a story that wraps neatly. People don't receive their consequences and then fold quietly into acceptance. There is struggle. There is negotiation. There is the human messiness of a person trying to find their footing when the ground has shifted beneath them. Kevin tried to explain himself, to Arthur, to Christine, and eventually to me. The explanation he gave to Christine was the one that troubled me most, because I love my daughter and I did not want this to hurt her. But the truth is, she had to hear it. She had to hear all of it, the way he had been treating me, the history she hadn't known. The building, the recommendation, the full picture that had been invisible to her because I had chosen to keep it so. Christine called me the day after. She was quiet on the phone in a way that told me she had been crying. I did not make her explain herself or justify herself. I did not say I told you so, because that has never been my language and it never will be. I simply listened. And when she was ready to speak, she said something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She said, "Mom, I'm sorry I let him make you small." That sentence broke something open in me that I hadn't known was still closed. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. I told her that she had been navigating a complicated situation and that I had understood that even when it hurt. I told her that what mattered now was not the past, but what came after it. Kevin's situation at the company became what I suppose could be described as professionally precarious. He was not fired that evening. I did not ask for that, and I would not have wanted it. But his standing changed. The way he was perceived changed. The invisible architecture of his position, which he had believed was built on his own abilities and his own performance, revealed itself to have dimensions he had not been aware of. And that revelation changed how he moved through that environment. He knew that I knew. He knew that Arthur knew. He knew that the woman he had looked through for years had been, the entire time, a presence in his professional world that was larger and more consequential than anything he had imagined. And that knowledge, from what Christine told me in the weeks that followed, was not easy for him to carry. I did not call him. I did not reach out. I did not demand an apology or a conversation. I waited because I have learned that some things cannot be rushed. Some understandings have to settle in a person before they become real. You cannot force someone to genuinely reckon with something. They have to arrive there themselves. He came to me eventually. Knocked on my door one afternoon a few weeks later, without Christine, just him. Standing on my front step, looking like someone who had spent a significant amount of time inside their own head and not particularly enjoyed the experience. He apologized. And I have thought about that apology quite a bit since then, turning it over, examining it, trying to understand whether it was genuine or whether it was simply the pragmatic apology of a man who understood he had damaged something important to his own interests. I think, honestly, it was both. I think it was a mixture. I think the humiliation of that evening in Arthur's office had cracked something in him, and I think within that crack there was something real. Something that had looked at itself clearly, perhaps for the first time, and not fully liked what it saw. I accepted his apology, not because everything was resolved, not because I was certain of his sincerity, but because holding on to unforgiveness would have required energy I preferred to direct elsewhere, and because Christine needed her family to move towards something rather than remain stuck in the wound. Things are different now, not perfect, different. Kevin is more careful with me. Whether that carefulness is respect or wariness, I honestly can't always tell. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe at this stage of my life, the distinction is less important than the result. Christine and I are closer than we have been in years. That, more than anything else, is what I hold on to from all of this. The phone calls are back to 3 times a week. The plans we make, we keep. When we sit together, she is present in the way she used to be before the distance crept in. Whatever this experience cost, the cost of what came back to me through, it was worth every bit of it. I sat in that waiting room for 4 hours. I sat there with aching feet and a bruised heart and a quiet, cold fury that had settled in somewhere it would not easily be moved from. I sat there and I watched other people be met by the people who loved them, and I felt, with a clarity that I haven't always had access to in my life, exactly who I was and exactly what had just happened and exactly what it meant. And I took out my phone and I made one call, short, calm, to the point. The kind of call that 31 years of building real relationships makes possible. The kind of call that reminds you, when you most need reminding, that quiet work accumulates, that every relationship you invest in honestly, every door you open for someone, every time you use your credibility and your judgment on behalf of another person, that none of it disappears. It doesn't evaporate into the air, it stays. It becomes part of the foundation of something larger than any single moment. Kevin walked into Arthur's office that evening thinking he was going to handle some professional matter that had come up unexpectedly. He walked out having discovered that the architecture of his world was different from what he'd believed, that the woman he had left on a pavement had been, in ways he never thought to ask about, woven into the very fabric of what he called his success. He thought he was self-made. He had no idea who had been making things possible. People sometimes think kindness means weakness. They mistake a quiet person for an empty one. They mistake generosity for naivety. They look at someone who doesn't shout about what they've built, who doesn't demand recognition for what they've given, who doesn't keep a visible ledger of every favor extended and every door opened, and they decide that person must not have much behind them, must not have much standing, must not be worth much consideration. That is a miscalculation that I have watched people make again and again across 68 years of living, and it almost never ends the way they expect. The truth is this: many of the doors you walk through in your life were opened quietly by someone you never bothered to appreciate, someone who made a call on your behalf, someone who said a word in the right room at the right time, someone who took a chance on you when they didn't have to, who extended their credibility in your direction without asking for anything in return, who made it possible for you to walk into that building every morning and sit at that desk and build the life you call yours. You may not know who that person is. You may never find out, but they exist. They exist in everyone's life in some form or another, and the failure to even consider that possibility, the failure to look at the people around you with enough humility to wonder what they might know that you don't, what they might have done that you're unaware of, what they might carry inside a quiet, unhurried life that you've never thought to ask about, that failure has a cost. I am Alina Whitmore. I am 68 years old. I worked for 31 years in a field that taught me, above almost everything else, the difference between what things appear to be and what they actually are. I built connections that survived decades because I built them honestly. I helped people when I could, quietly, without needing the credit, without keeping score. I invested in property, and I invested in people with the same principle. Choose carefully, choose based on real value, and take the long view. My son-in-law chose not to see me, chose not to know me, chose not to extend to me the basic consideration of asking who I was before deciding I wasn't worth his time. And on a side street, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, he told me to handle it myself. I did. I handled it exactly myself. And the lesson, I hope, was one he carries with him, not as a scar, not as a wound, but as an understanding. As the beginning of a different way of moving through a world that is full of people who are, beneath the surface of what's immediately visible, far more than you assumed them to be. Be careful how you treat people. Be careful what you assume. Be careful who you leave on the pavement, because the ground beneath your feet has a history, and you may not know who helped lay it.